Joe Montana is the GOAT. 4 Super Bowls, 0 interceptions. The man who invented modern winning, right? Wrong. What if I told you that the legendary West Coast offense, the system that built the 49ers dynasty, wasn't actually built for Joe Montana? What if I told you that while Joe was still a backup at Notre Dame, there was a man in Cincinnati already perfecting the 70% completion rate? A man with a bigger arm, a higher IQ, and stats that make Montana's look ordinary. For the fans who lived through the 70s and 80s, you remember the dart thrower. You remember the man who stood tall against the steel curtain when everyone else crumbled. You remember Ken Anderson. Today, we aren't just looking at highlights. We are exposing a travesty of history, a head-to-head comparison of forgotten QB and greatest ever Montana. We're going to look at the numbers the Hall of Fame voters seem to ignore, the secret Bill Walsh took to his grave, and the undeniable proof that Ken Anderson didn't just play the game, he invented the modern version of it. To understand the greatness of Ken Anderson, you have to understand the birth of an offense. Most fans think the West Coast offense started in San Francisco in 1979. It didn't. It started in 1968 on the banks of the Ohio River. Bill Walsh was an assistant for the legendary Paul Brown. The Bengals were an expansion team with a weak offensive line and a quarterback named Virgil Carter, who couldn't throw the ball 40 yards if his life depended on it. Walsh had to innovate. He designed a system of short, horizontal passes, using the pass to set up the run rather than the other way around, but the system needed a master. In 1971, the Bengals took a chance on a kid from Augustana College, a Division III school. Ken Anderson wasn't supposed to be a star. He was a 6 feet 3 inches, 210-pound project. But here is where the data starts to get scary. By 1974, Anderson wasn't just the starter. He was a phenomenon. In an era where the dead ball rules allowed defenders to practically mug receivers downfield, Anderson led the NFL in passing yards, 2,667, and completion percentage, 64.9%. Think about that. In 1974, the league average for completion percentage was around 52%. Terry Bradshaw, the man winning Super Bowls in Pittsburgh, wouldn't hit 60% completion for another decade. Anderson was nearly 15% better than the league average. In 1975, he did it again, back-to-back passing yardage titles. He was the first quarterback in the history of the AFL/NFL merger to lead the league in passer rating in consecutive years. He was the pilot of the West Coast system. He proved that you could move the ball with surgical precision instead of just praying for a deep ball. Bill Walsh later admitted that he programmed his quarterbacks in Cincinnati. But Ken Anderson was the only one who didn't need the programming. He had the processing speed of a computer before computers existed in the pocket. You want to talk about toughness? People say Joe Montana was tough because he took hits in the 80s. But Ken Anderson had to play in the AFC Central in the 1970s. That meant playing the Pittsburgh Steelers twice a year. We aren't talking about the modern Steelers. We're talking about the Steel Curtain, the greatest defense ever assembled. Mean Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Mel Blount. They were allowed to hit you in the head. They were allowed to clothesline receivers. In 1974, the Steelers had the #1 ranked defense in the world. They were mauling teams. Most quarterbacks faced that steel curtain and just hoped to survive. But on one legendary Sunday in 1974, Ken Anderson walked into that lion's den and completed 20 of 22 passes, 90%. Against the steel curtain, that record, the highest completion percentage in a single game, stood for 35 years until Kurt Warner finally broke it in 2009. Think about the difference in eras. Warner did it with hands-off rules. Anderson did it while Jack Lambert was trying to put him in a hospital. The fans who were there remember Anderson didn't have the flash. He didn't have the trash talk. He just stayed in the pocket, took the punishment, and delivered the most accurate balls the league had ever seen. But here is the tragedy of Ken Anderson's career. The Bengals were a small market team with a frugal owner. While the Steelers were building a dynasty around Bradshaw, the Bengals were letting talent walk out the door. Anderson was often a one-man army. He played under 5 different head coaches. He played through the transition of the 70s slugfest football into the 80s aerial football, and he dominated both. Now let's get to the direct comparison. 1981, the year the world changed. In San Francisco, Joe Montana was the rising star. He had the catch against Dallas. He was the media darling. But if you look at the 1981 MVP ballot, there was only one name at the top, Ken Anderson. At age 32, an age where most 70s quarterbacks were retiring or falling apart, Anderson had a career resurgence. He led the NFL in passer rating, 98.4, threw for 3,754 yards and had 29 touchdowns to only 10 interceptions. Then came January 10th, 1982, the AFC Championship, the Freezer Bowl. The temperature was -9 degrees. The wind chill was -59. It is officially the coldest game in NFL history. The opponent, Dan Fouts and the San Diego Chargers, the highest scoring offense in the league. Dan Fouts is a Hall of Famer. He had an arm like a cannon, but in that cold, Fouts couldn't grip the ball. He threw 2 interceptions and looked completely lost. But Ken Anderson? He looked like he was playing in a dome. He completed 14 of 22 passes for 161 yards and 2 touchdowns. No interceptions. He even rushed for 39 yards. Chris Collinsworth, his star receiver, said it was the greatest quarterback performance he had ever seen. He was throwing spirals in a hurricane, Collinsworth recalled. Anderson led the Bengals to Super Bowl XVI. This was his moment. This was the showdown. Ken Anderson versus Joe Montana. The teacher versus the student. The Bengals lost that game 26-21. But look at the box score. Joe Montana, 14 of 22, 157 yards, 1 touchdown. Ken Anderson, 25 of 34, 300 yards, 2 touchdowns. Anderson outpassed Montana by nearly 150 yards. He had a higher completion percentage. He led a furious comeback that fell just short because of a fumbled opening kickoff and a goal line stand for the ages. If the Bengals win that game, if they gain just 6 more inches on that goal line, Ken Anderson is a Super Bowl MVP. He is a lock for the Hall of Fame. But because the Bengals lost, the winner narrative was handed to Montana, and Anderson was pushed into the shadows. If you still aren't convinced that Anderson was technically superior, let's look at 1982. The 1982 season was shortened by a strike, but Ken Anderson used those 9 games to set a mark that was thought to be untouchable. He completed 70.6% of his passes for the entire season. You see 70% all the time now, but in 1982, that was alien technology. To put that in perspective, Joe Montana's career-high completion percentage was 70.2%, and he did that in 1989, at the peak of the 49ers' powerhouse years with Jerry Rice. Ken Anderson did 70.6% in 1982, throwing to Isaac Curtis and Dan Ross before the passing boom had even truly begun. Anderson's record stood for 27 years. It took Drew Brees, playing in a pass-friendly era with no-touch rules for receivers, until 2009 to finally eclipse that mark. When we talk about efficiency, We are talking about Ken Anderson. He led the NFL in passer rating 4 times. Joe Montana, twice. He led the NFL in passing yards twice. Joe Montana? Never. Let that sit with you for a second. The man we call the greatest pure passer of his era, Joe Montana, never once led the league in passing yards. Ken Anderson did it twice, and he did it while playing in a division that featured the most physical defenses in the history of the sport. So we have to ask the question, why is Ken Anderson not in Canton? As of February 2026, Ken Anderson is still waiting. He has been a finalist. He has been a senior nominee. And yet, every year the door stays shut. It is the most glaring oversight in the history of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. There are only 5 quarterbacks in the history of the NFL who have won 4 or more league passing titles. One is Sammy Ball, one is Steve Young, one is Roger Staubach. One is Drew Brees, and the 5th is Ken Anderson. Every other man on that list is a first ballot Hall of Famer, or will be. Anderson is the only one left out. Critics point to his 91-81 career record. They say he didn't win enough. But Dan Fouts is in the Hall of Fame with 0 Super Bowl appearances and an 86-71-1 record. Joe Namath is in the Hall of Fame with 173 interceptions to only 170 touchdowns. Terry Bradshaw is in the Hall of Fame with a career completion percentage of 51.9%, nearly 8 points lower than Anderson. The truth is, Ken Anderson is being punished for 3 things he couldn't control. He played in Cincinnati, a small market that the national media ignored. He didn't have a nickname or a brand. He wasn't Broadway Joe or the Snake. He was just a guy from Augustana who went to work. He lost the one Super Bowl he went to, even though he outplayed the man who won it. If Ken Anderson had played for the Cowboys, the Raiders, or the 49ers, there would be a statue of him in front of the stadium. He would have been a first ballot Hall of Famer in 1991. Bill Walsh once said, Ken Anderson was as good as anyone who ever played the position, and Walsh would know because he used Anderson to build the system that everyone now thinks belongs to Montana. History is written by the winners. We remember the rings, the parades, and the Gatorade showers, and Joe Montana deserves every bit of his legend. He was a winner. But if we are judging quarterbacks by the actual skill of playing the position, the accuracy, the intelligence, the ability to evolve with the game, and the mastery of the most complex offense in football, then Ken Anderson cannot be forgotten. He was the pilot. He was the one who flew the West Coast plane through the storm before it was ever cleared for takeoff. Without Ken Anderson, there is no Bill Walsh dynasty. Without Ken Anderson, the NFL might still be stuck in 1965, running the ball into a wall 40 times a game. To the fans who saw him stand tall against the Steelers in '74 or survive the frost of '81, you know what you saw. You saw a Hall of Famer. It's time for the rest of the world to catch up. If you think Ken Anderson belongs in Canton, or if you remember a specific play that proves his greatness, drop it in the comments. We need to keep this conversation alive until that gold jacket is finally around his shoulders. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the true history of the game, hit the like button and subscribe. We're going to keep uncovering the legends that the highlights forgot. I'll see you in the next one.